All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Verletta Kern. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the head of the Open Scholarship Commons and Digital Scholarship Librarian with the UW Libraries. I want to thank you for joining us for Hacking the Academy Simpson Center Digital Humanities Summer Fellow Showcase, which is co-sponsored by the UW Libraries Research Commons and Open Scholarship Commons, along with the Simpson Center for the Humanities. The Hacking the Academy series is designed to take a cross-disciplinary look at the new ways in which scholarship is produced, archived, evaluated, reused, and shared with wider publics. I want to pause for a moment and start our program off today with the reminder that the University of Washington Libraries acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, the Tulalip, and the Muckleshoot nations. And if you haven't had a chance, I'd encourage you to take a moment and learn about the history of the land that you're on, and we'll put a link in the chat where you can do so.
I think that's my cue. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present on what Andreas and I were able to work on this summer. Andreas and I were co-directors for this project that we worked on called Marlowe and Sheets, and I'm going to share a very brief slideshow. All right, Marlowe and Sheets really envisions itself, really to borrow from our website, its whole goal is to digitize the work of 16th century English dramatist and poet Christopher Marlowe in the play's original form, which was uncut sheets of paper. Having Marlowe's plays and poems in this manner means that the students can print, fold, and make their own Marlowe books, very much like the first early modern London readers did in the 1590s and 1600s. The heart of this project is the hope that it can bridge the disconnect between how modern readers, especially students, approach the text and how it would have been received and created in 16th century by 16th century readers and publishers. This project's focus is twofold. Really, it is editing and creating printable PDFs for download and assembly, and then providing a pedagogical resource for students and teachers to better understand and connect with late 16th century and early 17th century print culture. We do this by editing, arranging, and publishing downloadable PDFs as quarto sheets that students or instructors can then download, print, and assemble on their own. And I do want to say that this project kind of envisions itself as a sister project to Shakespeare in Sheets, which Andreas kind of like created in conversation with Professor Tara L. Lyons over at Illinois State University. And we had her blessing to go ahead and do this project. But yeah, the whole idea is that we take this image that you get from the library and then edit it, arrange it, and publish it as a quarto for students to download. And it's our hope that by the physical process of folding, cutting, and stitching, or usually stapling these quartos together, that these quarto images that you see here that are rather abstract things that are housed in some library somewhere in England or California or Texas can become something that the students can really hold, that becomes tangible. And if you pause and think, like so often today, when we read a text, we read it digitally, right? And it's kind of ironic that we're using digital humanities as a way to push back against that. We read them text on a screen, scrolling through this very clean, crisp, edited version of a text. And so we've hoped to kind of use a digital landscape to promote students to push back against that and create tangible books. Okay, so I'm talking about tangible books. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. So in this image here is an image of like what we would have gotten from the library. It's a scan of Hero and Leander, an original Marlowe print manuscript. We then took this, we edited it into black and white image. We made them into individual pages. We erased some of the ghosting you may see. Like you can see here, there's a little bit of bleed through with the page on the reverse side. Adjusted contrast to help them be more legible. And then we took these images and arranged them using an image editor into this quarto format. In the 16th and 17th centuries, plays would have been printed as a full sheet of paper with 4 pages on it. Students can then print these pages out front and back. And then once they have them printed out, you fold them to make a book. And you can see here, I've got the pages numbered, not in the order they go in, but in the order they appear on the quarto page. You print them out, you fold it, you cut the top so that then you have, well, this is just an 8-page book, right? But the whole play is then put together through stapling and stitching. This is a very physical process. And then we take these images that we've created and upload them to the website that Andreas and I made together this summer. And just to give you a quick tour of the website, we have a splash page here. And then on the side, we have where you can download the plays that I just introduced you to. We have them downloadable in A4 sizing, which is pretty standard, and then in A3 sizing, which is larger, more difficult to print, but more accurate to the size they would have been in the late 16th century. We have instructions here on how to print and assemble them, very step by step, because it can get complicated. And then we have a whole section here for pedagogy and resources, including print history of Marlowe's books, which is forthcoming, bibliography resources, and then a process video here that I put up to kind of walk people through like how we made these, right? And then I lastly want to acknowledge the Simpson Center for their funding, and also UW Libraries. We're able to host this through WordPress, through the UW Library account, and we all have access to hosting WordPress through the UW Libraries. That's my quick spiel. Questions later, and I'm going to pass over to Samantha now.
Thanks, Sarah, for sharing about your work. And thanks, everyone, for the invitation to share about my summer on digital humanities research project. My name is Samantha Thompson. I use pronouns she, her, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project that I've been working on. I'm still working on it. It's still a work in progress. I'm just going to share a couple of slides to sort of provide some visuals for what I'm talking about. I'm just going to leave it in this preview section. So my project is called We Deserve Rent Control, Digital Histories of Rent Control Debates in Seattle. And so in this project, I'm focusing specifically on the history of rent control debates and the stories of and how these debates sort of shape the stories and histories of housing development in Seattle. So rent control basically describes a law or policy that places restrictions on how much rent can increase over a given time period, or if the rent can increase at all. Rent control has been illegal in the state of Washington since 1981. That, of course, includes Seattle. And so this project really focuses in particular on this time period in the 1970s and 80s into the present moment. But the 70s and 80s is where we see a lot of these debates happen that we are still dealing with the repercussions of today. And so my goal with this project is to use the case of rent control to really strengthen our understanding of all of the ways that housing politics and experiences of housing crises are situated within power structures of race, gender, sexuality, and class. And so to do this, I have created a story map using the platform hosted by Esri. It originally intended to use an open source platform, but due to a series of decisions shifted back to Esri's platform. I'm happy to talk more about that decision-making process in the Q&A if you would like. And so basically what story maps are is they're interactive visual websites that tell stories. And typically they're tied to different spaces or geographies. So really effectively, I think they sort of help the user to really emplace the stories that they're engaging with, the histories that they're learning about, and become sort of more embedded within them. And so as I am building out this project, I'm approaching this story map as a counter mapping project. What that means, drawing on the work of Maharawal and McElroy, counter mapping in geography is, quote, a set of critical cartographic and feminist data visualization practices that seek to render visible the landscapes, lives, and sites of resistance and dispossession eluded in capitalist, colonial, and liberal topologies. And so I want users to be able to interact with these histories in an in-depth way, provoking them to think critically about how housing debates are portrayed in popular media, and considering how we might also organize around issues of housing justice to develop more equitable housing futures. And I like the story maps in particular because it combines text and images and audio to create, hopefully, this sort of in-depth embedded experience. And so there's a lot that happens in the rent control politics in Seattle. And so the story map is oriented around sort of a series of moments within rent control debates, rather than trying to encapsulate every little thing that happened. And focusing on these moments helps me to really situate the user around these particular moments in time, and sort of giving a bit more focus to them. I spend a lot of time in the project focusing specifically on what's referred to as initiatives 23 and 24, which happened in the late 70s and early 80s, where tenants were organizing for rent control in the city. And then eventually initiative 24 gets rejected and leads to the sort of banning of rent control at the state level, like I mentioned earlier. I'm also looking at the sort of more contemporary but temporary measures that were passed at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic that temporarily enacted a rent freeze in Seattle and in the state of Washington. A rent freeze is another form of rent control. And so I look at the ways that the debates around that sort of made new policies possible in the context of the pandemic, as the state was responding to a health crisis as well as a housing crisis. And so to sort of build out these histories, I draw mostly on archival documents and audio from the Seattle Municipal Archives. I also use archived articles from the Seattle Times, or what was then known as the Seattle Daily Times. And this summer, I was also a part of the UW Library's podcasting storytelling fellows workshop, and that enabled me to bring the audio from the archives into sort of short podcast episodes that are then embedded within the story map that help people to sort of hear the audio from the archives, but in a way that's more digestible than listening to like all 4 hours of a public hearing, for example. So I'm still working on this project. I have all the archival materials and I'm sort of making my way through them right now to decide which ones to bring into the story map. But I do have the intended launch date of launching this project in December. So with the time I have left, I just want to show you a little bit about what I have so far and play you a little bit from one of the podcast episodes. So this is what the story map looks like. It has a lot of different functionality in terms of how the user can interact with the medium. So across here at the top, you can see the different sort of moments in history. This is still very much a work in progress, but you can bring together text. I have here maps that I've created that show how rent control policy has shifted federally over time. So we saw a lot more rent control policy following World War II, and then gradually it shifts to being more limited. And then also another one here comparing the 1970s to today. So these are interactive maps where the user can use the slider to go back and forth between the different maps. I also have a couple of archival documents I know I'll be using that I've embedded here. And then here is an example of how the podcast episodes get embedded. I'm just going to play a short clip from that. I know I'm almost at time, so I just want to make sure that you can hear my computer.
Back. When we go to the polls, we will remember.
You hear that? Okay.
On January 11th, 1976, Seattle's Public Safety and Justice Committee held a public hearing on Marie Donahoe's rent control proposal. And this public hearing had quite the turnout. The Nisqually Room in the Seattle Center was absolutely packed as 400 people turned up. And over the next 3 hours, speakers would present their cases.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If I may have your attention, please. Call the meeting of the City Council's Public Safety and Justice Committee to order on this Tuesday, the 11th of January, 1977, at about 7:32 in the evening.
So that's just an example of how I'm bringing together both audio and images, and then also the text that I'm writing that sort of helps to sort of provide a container for all of these things by shaping the sort of narrative and how these debates help us understand responses to housing crises through intersecting social power structures. So that's the super brief intro. I'm happy to answer any questions about the project during the Q&A. Thank you.
I want to give a round of applause to Sarah and Samantha. Thank you so much for sharing these amazing projects. And also to CR for giving us some background and information on the fellowship program. I'm going to stop recording and we'll open it up for question and answer.